Hi, and welcome back to the channel. I am the Black Belt Barrister. You may have seen Dr. Shaham Das, consultant forensic psychiatrist, on my channel before. So we thought we'd bring you a short talk today on internet trolls and the psychology behind internet trolls. So first topic up, what are the motivations behind internet trolls? I've had some. I know you, Dr. Das, have had some as well. What do you think? Tell me about it.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your channel again, Daniel. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Love talking to your viewers. So yeah, internet trolls, I certainly have some experiences, which I'll come to if you're interested in hearing. But in terms of the research that I've done, I think the personality traits behind internet trolls tend to be things like impulsivity, selfishness. So when I say selfishness, I mean like a lack of empathy about who they're hurting or who they're talking about. They can be quite callous, certainly quite grandiose, and within that grandiosity there's quite a lot of entitlement. So certainly in some of the comments that I've heard, they feel that they have a right to tell people how to behave or what to think or what material they should or should not have on their channel. Now the thing that really strikes me about those personality traits is that they're very similar to a psychopath. So I'm not saying for a second that every single person that's an internet troll is a psychopath, because it's just statistically that doesn't make sense. 0.6% of the population are psychopaths, and I don't know what the percentage is, but it seems like a big proportion of people who comment are internet trolls. But I think what's interesting is that even if you have a little bit of those personality traits in real life, because of the anonymity of the internet, it kind of almost trumps those personality traits. So you probably wouldn't meet the threshold to be a psychopath in real life, but now you can hide behind a keyboard. You ramp up your hostility and hatred towards people.
Yeah, so you say you've had some experiences, and you'll come to those. I'll say I've had some experiences, although I don't interact. I've seen them. I've been tempted to interact sometimes, but I stop short of making it a public row. First of all, there's no sense in that. Secondly, it would be against my professional conduct to do so, so I don't. I have my views. I don't often share those views. I think I said to you before we started recording, I don't often share my views. I tend to give both sides of the equation on these kind of things. But from what you've said, I see the same thing. I see the sort of personality as someone that really wants their view across. They want everyone to know what their view is. I don't even like the term troll, but it's what everyone refers to it as. So there it is. But my experiences are what I've seen, and putting their views to everyone else, and they must accept their view. And if they don't, then there's some kind of criticism that follows. Is your experience similar?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm quite surprised that you have trolls, because I've seen many of your videos, and you seem to be informing rather than giving an opinion. So, you're saying this is the law.
Certainly
so,
try.
To me, it doesn't seem that it's anything that you say is controversial, because you're just saying facts. So that's surprising. Well, it surprises me to a degree, because I don't think your information is provocative, but then having now learned what some people are like, then it doesn't surprise me. I suppose in terms of what I've experienced, so a good example is I did a video about personality disorders. Yeah. So I was basically describing what they are, and just for your viewers, I'll sum it up in 30 seconds. So personality disorders are ingrained. They're like character flaws, as opposed to a mental illness, which is a change in your baseline self. So it's like a chemical imbalance that makes you have symptoms like hearing voices. So anyway, all I did was merely state what a personality disorder is. I talked about the different types. And then I got quite a lot of negative comments of people, some of whom I presume probably have personality disorders, because I think it's quite labeling, and it can be quite damaging for some people to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. And I get that. I think that's actually a reasonable point of view. But they weren't sort of saying this is an opinion, what do you think? They were sort of saying, how dare you talk about this, and how dare you make these how dare you be so judgmental, and a bit like what I think your videos are like. I wasn't, in my mind, I wasn't making a judgment. I was just saying this is what the definition is. But I suppose my point is that they can, from my experience, they can find something that we might consider neutral, and they assume that we're making a judgment. So they're fighting the counter argument from that. But we're not making a judgment. We're just stating facts, I think.
Indeed. I suppose it would be easier in some cases for me to cast judgment, because if, let's say I'm talking about some sort of heinous crime or even a trivial crime, I can still comment that it's wrong, albeit I think a lot of people take the view that a lawyer will just always defend the indefensible, and not take any view on crimes, criminality, negative behavior. Of course we do. But as I said to you again before we started recording, our opinions don't matter. If we represent somebody, we're instructed to represent somebody, obviously innocent until proven guilty. Case has got to be proven and all that. But if someone is guilty, they are convicted, they have been convicted, and anything like that, it would be easier to express some kind of judgment in that sense, even though I don't. But I wonder whether some people that comment, whether they perhaps self-attribute some of what you're saying about personality traits. Perhaps they self-attribute some of those, or they recognize some of that in themselves, don't like it, and therefore criticize you for it, perhaps.
Absolutely. So I think, from my experience and also from reading around the subject, I think that they fall into categories of what they're. So I talked before about the personality structure, but in terms of what the actual reasoning, what their motivation is, sometimes it's very personal. So there's like vitriol against the person, not just from my experiences, but in general. That could be, sexist, homophobic. I know there's a lot of females who get a lot of misogynistic, very sexually aggressive kind of messages, and that's just personal. There's no sort of intellect or argument behind that. And then sometimes they can dismiss the individual, or even dismiss like what that individual represents. So, for example, I've definitely had comments of people who've had bad experiences with psychiatrists, and they probably have. Like I'm sure that happens. I'm sure some people are not happy with the kind of treatment they get. The world that I work in, I detain people against their will and medicate them against their will because they're dangerous at times. So I don't expect people to always be happy with my intervention. But I think what they do is they project. So because they've not liked a psychiatrist in the past, they dislike all psychiatrists. They dislike seeing psychiatrists on YouTube, and they kind of, by extension, they want to attack me personally. So do you think that's relevant with your situation as well? Might they have had a barrister that's kind of put them away in the past?
I think it is. I think it is. It's not necessarily if the person holding the view is the one that has been prosecuted or on the wrong side of a case, or maybe they've seen it, but maybe they are on the wrong side of a case. I've seen one. I'm not going to name anybody, of course, but I've seen one example where the individual was clearly involved in a case that I'll say wasn't going well. I don't know how the case was going. All I do know from what was said, that it was a long, drawn out, expensive, difficult, emotional process. But that's what it is. That's what the court process, the legal process is. Most people will be surprised to hear that the average duration for a case, even a small claim, will be a couple of years before it comes to fruition. And even then, with a judgment in hand, if the company disappears or the individual disappears, then maybe you're left with nothing after all of that, all of the expense and everything else. And therefore, I think a lot of people tend to blame lawyers for that, because they see lawyers as charging lots of money to give advice, to give representation. But of course, every profession has its scale of charges, and it is what it is. But I think a lot of people take that view because they see the difficulties, whether they're involved in it or not. And perhaps the same is true for you.
Yeah. So I think when you were saying that, what I was thinking is that psychiatry, I would fully admit, has a dark past, from asylums to frontal lobotomies to, ECT without any kind of anesthetic or muscle relaxant, to what else have we done? To claiming that homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder, and that only changed a few decades ago. Yeah, and I accept all of those things. I'm not married to defending psychiatry at every possible.
Law has its equivalents. Trial was not always what it is today. Trial by ordeal. I don't know if you're familiar. People will be made to walk and carry hot iron rods, and if the injury is healed within a certain amount of time, they were innocent. Otherwise, they were guilty. All sorts of strange things. But obviously, again, that was a long time ago. You mentioned in the notes as well some high-profile internet trolls.
So I suppose the kind of level of trolling that we're experiencing is containable, and I think we're both older more mature, so it's not something that's going to sort of break us
I
personally.
suppose before we move on to that, have you got some sort of closing advice for anybody that is experiencing what you might term low-level internet trolls? What would you say?
I mean, my advice would be the most obvious form of advice, which would be just to ignore it. You know,
Likewise.
so the other thing so I'll quickly tell you about another situation where I've had trolling because it ties into my advice. So I had this quite controversial, I think is fair to say, guest on called Decker Heggie, who is a complicated man. You know, he's an ex bare knuckle boxer. He was a self-confessed cocaine addict for 15 years. You know, this is stuff that he's quite happy to put out there, and he's had a number of charges. I think he's been to prison before, and he was talking about his kind of rehabilitation and the way he's turned his life around. And he seems to have an army of haters on the internet who have accused him of lots and lots of different crimes, some of which just has to be bullshit because they're very, very serious crimes, and he's been, you know, investigated and he's not been charged for those particular things. And my point is that when he went on, I received a lot of very negative comments and quite entitled comments like, "This is what you should do. You should take him down. This is what your channel should. This is kind of material and kind of guests your channel should have." And even sort of slightly threatening, "We will go to the greater authorities that, you know, like the General Medical Council." So that's what really struck me, that it's not just we don't like what you're putting out, it's we're telling you what you think you should do. But anyway, my advice would be just forget about it because it does fade. Like, so that there's a massive peak in these hateful messages. And then I've not heard a peep out of anybody for about 2 or 3 weeks after that. So my advice would be, you know, just ride it out. It's more likely than not, it will die down fairly quickly.
And I would say the same because, as I think I said earlier, I've been tempted to respond to some with certain, let's call it guidance, what I would say. But even then, there's a certain degree that it isn't worth responding to, because if someone is of a certain mindset, then whatever you say is not going to help anyway. So there's no sense in doing that.
Absolutely. You can tell by the tone of their messages that they're not trying to open a discussion or debate. They're just, you know, trying to shut you down with victory. So it's not that dissimilar to when I'm on a psychiatric ward and I have like delusional, agitated patients. I'm not going to argue with them about their delusions, am I? So it's not.
That's what they experience, and it's a very real thing, which is something actually I think is going to cross over with what we will come on to. But yeah, no, I thought those are interesting closing comments, and I agree. I would just say to ignore it, that kind of thing. And I think the same goes not just internet trolls as such, but sort of persistent annoyances that people might experience. I would say if you can, ignore it. But I would also, at the same time, I always say on my channel, evidence is everything. Keep the evidence, document it, diarize it, dates, times, everything, if you do want to do anything about it later. Because there is a case, I'm going to do a video about it, actually, where the internet trolls have gone to prison. So this is a thing now.
Okay.
And speaking of more serious ones, I think you were going to go on to say.
Just so I know a little bit, just because I have not got around to doing this, but I've always intended to write an episode for my channel about high-profile internet troll cases. So there's one that really struck me. It was a young girl called Hannah Smith who basically committed suicide in 2013 because she was just trolled constantly through the internet. She was 14, I believe, at the time. So just really sad, tragic case. And then what's even worse than that is that after she killed herself, the same trolls targeted her family. So they targeted her 16-year-old sister and also her father, blaming them for trying to gain sympathy by, you know, putting up memorials on Facebook, etc. So that's the one that I've read about a few, but that's the one that really struck me, because, you know, how heartless and callous must you be to go after a young girl and then their family after that. Like, it's really just absolutely disgusting and pathetic. But the other thing that I know about, because I heard a lecture about it during my training, is the case of this game called the Blue Whale Suicide Game. So basically it was designed on the dark web intentionally to try and push young, vulnerable people towards committing suicide. Right. And what it would be is you join this sort of secret online game. I think they reached out to people through chat rooms, etc. And they would give the player, like a series of small challenges of increasing boldness. So whether that would be to like play truant from school or go and shoplift or swear at your parents. So each time you did something, you got sort of points and kudos. and they would become more and more bold. And I think they'd intentionally target people who they believed to be vulnerable and isolated. And the ultimate aim was to try and convince them to commit suicide. And it actually worked. So about 2 or 3 kids in the UK actually went on to take their lives because they had this kind of pressure from the people playing this game.
It's terrible. And I think it is important to talk about these things. And obviously on my channel, your channel, which you'll talk about in a minute, I think it's important to talk about these things because many of the videos, especially recently, I've done with the specific intent of spreading the word about certain things to say that people must know about these things, because if you don't know, you're unsuspecting. And if you're unsuspecting, no one goes out thinking that they will get scammed, defrauded, and yet it happens billions of pounds worth every year. If I were to tell you about one of them, you would say, no way, that wouldn't happen to me. And yet there's so many stories where it certainly does happen in exactly that way. And
I mean, people wouldn't carry on trying if it didn't work. You know, you get all these emails from Nigerian princes that have won the lottery. They must work, because if they never worked, then the scam would stop.
Exactly. Anyone's watching now, check your spam. I mean, don't click anything and don't actually follow through with anything, but check your spam and check all the ridiculous emails that are in there. But they are sent for a reason, because a very small percentage of people do follow them through. And so when you get games like this that are encouraging negative behavior, there's no other way of putting it, negative behavior, damaging behavior, people have to know about it, and they have to know about it to be able to recognize it and to stop it.
Absolutely. And the parents as well, not just the young individuals that are enticed, but, you know,
exactly.
It's not a comfortable question to ask, but you kind of have to, it can't be ignored. Like, what is the parents' role? What were they doing? How can they not be, you know, they can't watch everything that their kids do online all the time. That's not feasible, but you should at least have an understanding and overview of what kind of things they're getting into, I think.
And it's a side note, makes me think, actually, since I became a barrister, because I wasn't always a barrister, I've been in business for many, many years before that. But I think the combination of being in business and then becoming a barrister made me question everything. I don't take anything on face value anymore. I question if somebody says, you know, so-and-so, this boy or whatever is 15 years old. My first question is, how do you know? How do you know it's 15? How do you know it's a 15-year-old boy, even if it's on the internet, rather than, you know, a 30, 40-year-old man trying to connect to this person or whatever it might be? My first response is always to question until it's verified, because it's evidence-based. And if it's not evidence-based, I don't take it. You'll be the same in your line of work, no doubt.
So I think we're both telling our viewers to be very paranoid and suspicious of everybody.
Absolutely. It's a sad state to be in, isn't it? But that's where we are. But I think that leads nicely into another point that you had on the list of things to chat about, was the links between video games and violence. Now, I'll go first. I think I've always said, my personal view is that there has been a definitive link, and I don't know what the studies say, you'll tell me in a minute, but I've always felt that there is a link between video games that portray violence and real violence. And there are some stories that I've heard about personally through family members in China, where people have gone out and stabbed somebody else, killed somebody else, thinking that they will respawn as if it's a game. And it's outrageous, but those are stories I've heard. But now you'll tell me what the actual studies say.
So studies over time have not shown a link between violence and video games, but I would respectfully not disagree with the findings, because you can't disagree with facts, you can't disagree with science. But I would say that it's a bit more complicated and layered than what studies can show, and I'll explain myself. So, firstly, to put it into context, I think one big kind of key point was that the Columbine high school shooters were avid video game players. They played this game called Doom, and so that shooting happened in April '99, and that started a bit of a media fracas about whether there is this connection. But actually, American studies have shown that in terms of high school shooters, of which sadly there's so many of them over the years that they can actually do this kind of study, only about 12% of the perpetrators were like seriously invested in video games. So on the surface, it looks like there isn't a link. However, I think there is a link, but I think it's quite convoluted, and I think there's like what's the word? confounding factors. So I'll give you a specific example. I think that some of the issues might be about discipline. So if you've got I've got it put into context. I've got two boys, 6 and 8. They're just getting into their video games. You know, if I didn't put my foot down, they would literally be on the iPads all day, every day, every weekend. Like, we have to give them limits. So what I'm saying is if you have a situation where you don't have these boundaries and discipline, and you let your kids play hours and hours of video games, I don't think it's necessarily the video games themselves that might lead them to antisocial behavior, including violence. I think it's the lack of discipline, lack of boundaries, making them possibly feel isolated and marginalized. So what I'm saying is, if you can't control your own kids to say, you shouldn't be, this is the number of hours you're allowed to play on video games, then the chances are at some point down the line, you also can't control your kids when they talk back, when they, you know, start acting antisocially. So I think it's more complicated. I think it's about sort of discipline. And I also think that another context is about their sort of social environment and their outside influences.
Yes.
So I haven't really played that many violent video games, maybe Street Fighter 2. I've got my own Street Fighter 2 arcade in the background. But I did definitely listen to a lot of gangster rap growing up, you know, from Snoop Doggy Dogg, NWA. And I used to love it because it's cool, you know, when you hear people from the hood talking about drive-by shootings and blah, blah, blah. When you're an impressionable young teenager like I was, it sounds cool. But I never went out and hurt anybody. I never even considered ever doing a drive-by. But in another set of circumstances, if you had another young man or woman, but probably more likely to be a man, who didn't have, you know, a stable environment, who might have grown up in poverty, who might have been like a victim of physical abuse, who might have lived in a neighborhood where these things actually happen, you know, the ghetto, where there is drug dealing and there is, you know, a lot of violence around them and gang activity, then I don't think the music would push them into doing that, but it'd be one of many factors that would make it seem as if it's acceptable.
That's interesting. Because I've always felt that there must be some connection. If there's a familiarity with playing those sorts of things, a familiarity with even the, I mean, was it? I stand to be corrected, but I think it was Lego that said that they never wanted to create sort of war toys because they didn't want war to be thought of as a game and things like that. I think it was Lego. I'll stand to be corrected, but I always thought like that. And you're right. Playing the games doesn't mean you're going to go out and reenact it, recreate it.
Yeah, but I think the vast majority of people wouldn't go out and reenact it. So. You know, like violent films. Lots of kids watch violent films. I certainly did when I was younger. But again, I never went out and had any urge to reenact it. But again, if you live in a violent environment where you witness these things in real life, plus you see them on TV, then I think it's just one of many confounding factors that might contribute. But if do you remember the case of James Bulger?
Yes.
Which is for those who don't know, it's a horrific case of a young, I think he was only 3 years old, was he? Who was killed by
three, I think, yes.
Two 10-year-olds, and they said that they were copying scenes from the horror film Child's Play with that doll. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that obviously thousands, tens of thousands of people have seen that film, but only those two kids actually went out and reenacted it. So it can't just be the exposure; it's got to be about more than that.
More than one thing. And do you think age plays obviously it does, but what sort of significant factor would it play? I mean, for example, I know lots of people as youngsters would not have minded watching violent films, but as they get older, they say, I can't watch that anymore. I can't bring myself to watch these horrors or violent films anymore.
Yeah, I suppose it's more about maturity levels than it is about chronological age. And different people's are quite, you know, they grow different sensibilities. So I, for example, I'm not very squeamish at all. Never really get freaked out by any kind of violence. Whereas my wife, like, can't watch anything that's like too shocking or too violent. She'll literally have to close her eyes.
Yeah, I think it's never been squeamish about anything. It's never bothered me. No.
So I think it's all about, you know, personality and tolerance as well. The age thing's the age thing's interesting. It's quite hard to know for definite, really. I mean, obviously, if very young kids are being exposed to high levels of violence, then that can never be a good thing. That's just going to inure them to emotions and feelings. But when it gets into adolescence, I think it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah. So, any thoughts for parents that are watching that have children that are on these games and are worried about them playing these games?
I think it's a fine line, because it'd be easy for me to say you should never expose your children to any kind of violence at all. That would, be.
I think that's what people would expect you to say.
Yeah, but I'm not going to say that, because
Yeah.
I was exposed to violent films and violent music when I was a kid, and it's had no bad effect on me. Nobody can prove anything. So I think it's, instead of just giving that kind of anodyne advice, I would say it depends on the individual kid. If you can see that your kid gets wild up and they get agitated and they're reenacting things that are making you feel uncomfortable, then I think that is a warning sign that you need to sort of step in. But I think you just have to be mature about it and see, your own kids better than anybody else. You have to see how they react to things. And the other thing I'd say is that if you just blanket ban things that other kids are into, then it's not going to work, I don't think. So if, like, hypothetically, there's a child who likes, I don't know, Call of Duty, and all of his friends are into Call of Duty, and then you ban it because you think that it's violent because you're going around shooting people, then that might make your kid a bit of an outcast, because his friends,
won't they, I suppose.
Yeah, so you've got to balance it against the sort of unhappiness and dissatisfaction they'll find from being forced in that situation.
Yeah, fascinating. So clearly not as clear cut as a lot of people might think.
There's just one other thing I'd like to talk about, if that's all right, Daniel. So one kind of specific, quite rare but specific context that we haven't discussed is when you have somebody that plays violent video games and they're actually psychotics, they've actually got a mental illness.
Yes, indeed.
So you said that, did I get this right? You've got relatives in China who have heard of people going out and
yes,
shooting?
I mean, they were unconnected, but they have heard of these sort of things where it's been known that there are events that they believe are reenacting games and things like that. Yes.
So I would think that that person that's doing that is either extremely immature and naive, or probably has some sort of mental illness, because the average, compass mentis person would not go and do that. And I do think that if you're actually psychotic, then by definition, you've got a difficulty in differentiating reality from fantasy, from hearing auditory hallucinations, like the voices that are not there, to having paranoid delusions. So a case that I know quite well, because I've done a video on it on my channel, is Daniel Gonzalez. So in September 2004, he went on a killing spree. So he's from Sussex, and he went across London and Sussex over the space of a couple of days and attacked random people, and he killed 4 random people and injured 2. Then he went to Broadmoor because he was psychotic, and then he actually killed. So he went to Broadmoor in 2006 and killed himself a year later whilst he was in Broadmoor. And the reason I bring this up is because not only did he play video games, but he was also used to watch horror films, and he's obsessed with Freddy Krueger. And during his assessments, he said that he kind of believed he was Freddy Krueger.
Right.
So obviously, I'm not trying to alarm our viewers, but I think in exceptionally rare cases, there are people who actually suffer from mental illness who incorporate video games and other things they might see that promote violence, and they can't. It's not, it's not. They're not doing it on purpose. They literally don't have the mental ability to differentiate reality.
Yeah. So in their mind, they've made it part of their personality, haven't they? As such.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And therefore going on to reenact it and things like that. It's fascinating, but at the same time, as I said, one of the primary goals, and you can talk about yours, but one of my primary goals for this channel was to educate, to spread word, to spread knowledge, and I felt that a lot of people were disillusioned with the legal system because they didn't have adequate access to the legal system, and even when they paid for services, it is expensive to be blunt about it. It is expensive to get representation, and the better representation you get, the more it costs. So I created this channel to try to, without being condescending, to share knowledge with people that don't have it, to give an access to this sort of information that they can't get elsewhere or can't digest elsewhere. All of the legislation is out there. Everybody can go and read it. All of the cases, all the judgments are out there. You can go and read them. But if it takes me a few hours sometimes to sit and read a judgment to understand it, and I'm trained to do that, then I can understand it being difficult. So that's why I created my channel. And this, I thank you for coming on it to be part of that journey, and you've got similar goals. So you can tell my viewers about your goals, your channel.
Okay, sure.
Obviously, we'll link it in the description.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I think one of your skills, and I'd like to think it's similar to my skills, is that you take something that's very complicated and formal and stuffy, and you kind of boil it down into sound bites that are really easy to understand. So even though all that material's out there, you need like a conduit like yourself and hopefully myself to make it understandable and entertaining. And also, congratulations on the growth of your channel. I think it's been doing really well recently. So just to shamelessly plug my channel, A Sight for Sore Minds, it is like a crossover between mental illness and offending. So it's not like yours. Yours is more kind of informative about very specific areas of the law. Mine's more about individual cases. So high profile cases like, so for example, I've done Catherine Knight recently, who's the first woman who to ever have a full life term in Australia because she killed and beheaded her husband and tried to feed that to the head to the family. So I kind of psychoanalyze the personality traits and the law. Sometimes I look at mental illness itself. So for example, I've done a video on autism and why I think it's overdiagnosed and what I think the problems are with that. So yeah, it's both to entertain and educate, I think. That's my goal.
Absolutely.
And also my own narcissism, I think, is sprinkled on there as well.
Well, I think who was it? I can't remember who was it that said everybody has a certain level of it, especially those that take a public stance and try to help and educate. So I'm sure we all do. But that link will be in the description. I've certainly enjoyed watching your channel. I'm sure everybody watching my channel, I would enjoy watching yours as well. Very similar in the way that you put it across to the way I've intended to put it across. So hopefully people will enjoy that. And there's a perfect crossover in a number of ways with this. So I'd like to have you back again. Let's do this again.
Absolutely. It'd be a pleasure. Good to see you, Daniel.
Thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for watching. Take care.
Goodbye, everybody.